Hello, everyone. I am picked myself up, dusted myself off, and am launching into 2020 with a late entry in the Cromwellathon, which is Jason over at Old Blues Chapter and Verse is hosting a read-along of Hilary Mantel's Thomas Cromwell novels, starting off this month with Wolf Hall. Next month being Bring Up the Bodies. We'll get to that when we get to it. And the third one, this one, I can never get the name straight. The Mirror and the Shadow in the Mirror and the Light. Something like that. We'll get to that when we get to that. I'll share my feelings. I feel somewhat certain I'm probably going to get to that third book when it does come out. But yeah, let's get into this. It was first published in 2009. And I've been reading that concurrently with Thomas Cromwell, A Revolutionary Life by Diarmaid MacCulloch. I forgot to get the year. I think it's 2018, 2017 biography of Thomas Cromwell. Very much straight ahead biography of Thomas Cromwell. But Diarmaid MacCulloch is doing a really good job of presenting that paperwork. Sometimes an overwhelming blizzard of paperwork. And it brings Wolf Hall into kind of a sharper relief because of it. I actually recommend reading. I'm about 45% of the way through this book, which is we're up to year. I think we're up to 1537. This book goes from 1500 to 1535, which gives you an idea of exactly it's the years that we have Thomas Cromwell are actually in power or close to power, where there's stuff to kind of for an author to get into, whether a biographer or a historical novelist, as in Mantel's case. So who the hell is Thomas Cromwell? Thomas Cromwell was rose from kind of humble beginnings of a Putney craftsman, something like that, up to the very kind of the tippy top of the political world, as far as you could go without being a king. He was the kind of the first minister in for Henry VIII, and helped engineer the annulment of his first marriage, and is credited as basically one of the great shapers of the Protestant Reformation. Also, I guess notorious in Catholic circles for having shut down like most of the monasteries of a Catholic England, and basically shaping how Protestant England was going to happen past that point. It seems in some ways, without the actual full knowledge of Henry VIII, who wasn't a details guy. It's interesting how someone as this tyrant, this guy who could, Henry VIII, who could fly into rages and had people killed when he either you really loved you or he flipped on a dime and he hated you. And we indeed see this with Thomas Cromwell's first sort of mentor, Cardinal Wolsey, in Wolf Hall, where he when you fail to actually do what Henry VIII wants done, even if it's sort of impossible to get done, he flips on a dime and you die. So this is a Thomas Cromwell is a fellow who not only survived in this kind of a snake pit of a court where everyone is just basically out for everyone else's blood. He thrived as a low-born guy, resented by nobles, and rose to like probably arguably the second most powerful man in the land for as long as that lasted. Spoilers for the 1500s of events that happened there. So how am I getting on with the book? This is a reread of Wolf Hall for me. I only read Wolf Hall. I've only read Wolf Hall. I did not go on and read Bring Up the Bodies. I was ambivalent about Wolf Hall as a work of historical fiction, and I think that may have more to do some ways how I feel about historical fiction. Though we can also get into the specific case of Hilary Mantel and her love relationship with Thomas Cromwell, because I do believe that I guess everyone, if you're going to have a subject that you're going to I mean, she's been writing about the dude since, like, it was published in 2009. How long before that she was living with Thomas Cromwell? She's lived with this guy for a long time, and I don't think you have to have a certain amount of affection to be with a fellow. And I will probably, I would argue she's got a very, very soft spot for Thomas Cromwell. Um, so but I didn't go on because I guess as I read it the first time, and this was nobody who, not really somebody who's got like expertise in Tudor England. I just felt, wow, this book really seems to be on Thomas Cromwell's side. And wow, Thomas More, who does come up in this book, Thomas More comes off in this book as, it's funny, of the kind of the slimy or rage-filled or kind of Machiavellian people that are in this book. To me, Thomas More comes off as the scariest dude in this book. And indeed, at least in the early bits of this, he is very much, you could see him as the anti-Thomas Cromwell. He's someone who we find out that he was a favored boy. Indeed, they seem to, Mantel at least imagines that their paths slightly crossed, where More was given all the advantages, got all the education and stuff like that, even though he maybe not been, royalty or aristocracy. He got all the advantages, where, Thomas Cromwell, we start off this book, he's getting beaten, pummeled by his father. It's like there's this tyrannical giant figure standing over young Thomas Cromwell at the start of this book. It's like that scene, the scene at the beginning of Thomas Cromwell getting beaten as a boy by his father, is like, this is the opening thesis. This is the strong opening thesis of get up of Hilary Mantel's book. You've got this small figure being beaten by this huge tyrannical figure, which, obviously, as we go later in the book, there are many other figures of, this is the underdog Thomas Cromwell working his way through this system. This aristocracy, this thing of powerful men, this of violence, and he is this kind of meek, he's this quiet, understated fellow who is navigating through a thing, where I was talking. See, I've gone off on all my tangents already. You've got Thomas More, who is this kind of, he is so cold, and he's shown as so kind of cold and kind of just bloodless fellow, someone who, like, you're like, oh God, I'm going to die just being in his presence, and who is harshly ideological and is cold and inhumane, whereas Thomas Cromwell is seen as kind of practical and the warmth and charming, and a charming fellow. This is how he survives. But it's like Thomas More does not have to bend for anyone, will not bend for anyone. Indeed, if you know the history of Thomas More, he does not bend at all. He stays true to whatever his ideology is, whatever else you might say about him. There's also a thing of, Thomas Cromwell in this book, he's seeing, like, his warmth of his relationship with his wife, and indeed, touching scenes at the early parts of this book where his wife dies, and he's like, and people saying, oh yeah, remarry. And he's like, that's not going to happen. And there's a comment made about Thomas More, which is like, oh yeah, if his wife died, he'd have another woman in here, like, within the week, basically. They're all women are disposable to this guy. And indeed, they have this dinner party where, for entertainment, Thomas More basically humiliates the women of his house. It's like he's shown as the deep misogyny, which in some ways is probably, you have the sense of, you feel from writings of the time of, like, oh, do women actually have souls, and that sort of thing. I don't know if that's a Thomas More thing, but that kind of questions, like, do women have souls? Are they actually people? I mean, legally they actually aren't considered people. They're chattel. That's actually probably the much more mainstream point of view. And Thomas Cromwell, who seems to respect the women in his life, who cherishes his daughters, and the deaths that happen around him, he cares about. It's like, but Thomas More is shown as like, yeah, completely callous, completely aloof from all this stuff, which is somewhere where I get into the whole kind of, we're really on Thomas Cromwell's side here, and we're really not on Thomas More's side here. And going from the Thomas Diarmaid MacCulloch's kind of historical book, you can see that, well, actually, both of these men did some really horrible things. They engaged in torture, engaged in executions, were both ruthless in their own ways, good on Hilary Mantel and answering historians. There had been a push of like, Thomas Cromwell is just a secular politician who was ruthless for his master and was basically just worshiping the power of the state. And it's like, no, actually he had his own beliefs. He had his own kind of had his own agenda that he actually wanted to push forward, and indeed maybe navigated around King Henry VIII about. But it's like this. It's that's the thing. I guess I'm getting to slowly in this me nattering on, is the idea, the role of historical fiction, is like, and the role of history. Is it to be strictly objective, and is there such a thing as being strictly objective? Different historians have different interpretations of the facts. Hilary Mantel is taking a figure who maybe because Cromwell, spoiler alert, is not kind of a winner out of this situation. A lot of his papers have been carefully pruned and edited, and a lot of his own words have been taken away from him that way. And Mantel is kind of imagining that, bringing that back into life, of what her thoughts of what he might be like. While at the same time, is historical fiction is as much about the time period that is writing, like it's as much 2009 is as much in this book as the 1500s are in this book, maybe perhaps more so, because it's the concerns of an author in 2009 and how she sees someone like Thomas Cromwell being a sympathetic character, a humane character, someone who actually respects women, navigating this world, is talking about kind of hopes and dreams of our age, maybe more so than they are. We can, each generation constructs its own history, and Hilary Mantel and Diarmaid MacCulloch are definitely constructing a different history that's perhaps not as also, Diarmaid MacCulloch actually is probably more kind of focused on the religion, at least so far, of Thomas Cromwell, of his thoughts on the Reformation. Indeed, Diarmaid MacCulloch is someone who has written books about the Reformation writ large, something I would like to consult next, whereas Hilary Mantel is definitely telling a much more personal, much more intimate story of Wolf Hall. One of the kind of the gripes that people have with this book is that she has this, what's been described as a tick or a stylistic thing of, if you find a kind of a random he referred into the book, that he will be Thomas Cromwell, and people are somewhat off-put by this. I actually don't find it. Maybe it's because it's my second reading. I haven't found it off-putting at all. I find this an incredibly easy book to read. Don't let it being a Booker Prize winner fool you. It's actually readable. It's one of those readable Booker Prizes versus one of those, oh my God, there's so much style in here that I have to wade through to get to the story. It's like, no, this is beautiful language used to tell a story, and to kind of very kind of in an episodic way kind of hop around, but it's just kind of, it's all building. I feel it all building in this very kind of subtle, understated way, because Thomas Cromwell is a character, even in here where Hilary Mantel is imagining him, somewhat recedes from me. He somewhat recedes from me. I don't know if that's because of I'm thinking about this is an imagined Thomas Cromwell, and that's always foremost in my head. Whereas if this was Chucky James of the 1500s and he was completely made up, I would just kind of let myself sink into it. But that he is Thomas Cromwell holds him at a certain kind of remove for me. But see, I'm scattershot all over the place. Sorry, Jason. So there's this thing of historical fiction versus what might be considered what's considered nonfiction, and it's an uncomfortable thing that I think both books, these are both imagined Thomas Cromwells. This one is much more kind of wedded, very wedded, very in a principled way to the documentation. This is heavily documented. And even so, he's still making definite interpretations of the facts. This is a book where you can feel all the work that's gone into this, all of her own research that has gone into this, and she's had to make her own decisions. Things as simple as, well, not simple, but just as the fact of, we don't have direct evidence that Thomas Cromwell was ever abused by his father, but that is the first image that Hilary Mantel puts at the front of this book, and that's a decision that she has made. There's stuff like Cardinal Wolsey, that he was a guy who was enriching himself by closing monasteries. It was a proto for what became the larger thing with Cromwell and Henry VIII. He was closing monasteries to found a college for his glory, and actually they don't mention in the book to get monies and everything together so that he could build basically a giant mausoleum for himself, one that would have been the most fabulous mausoleum. And indeed, with his fall, Henry VIII comes in and goes, yoink, I'm taking this stuff. And that's how Cromwell began. He was the Italian Englishman. He had lived in Italy. He was a fluent Italian. And he was the guy. He was the go-between between the cardinal and the Italian craftsman, the greatest craftsman of the age, to do it. So he was using kind of all this ill-gotten gains to do it. Now, the cardinal could have also been doing this to kind of reform the church, but he was also doing it to fill his own pocketbooks, which is a nice little mirror to what happens later with Henry VIII, who is definitely, oh yeah, okay, Reformation, but I can also get money out of this. I can get money, and I want money because I want to go to war. And Cromwell's got his own kind of like, oh sure, I'll do that for you, but it's going to further my own agenda. And he very much has his own agenda. And Cromwell, as a politician, as we'll see, really sucks up the power in a way that makes me think of, communist states where you have someone like Joseph Stalin taking small little positions and piecing them together and improvising to get more and more power. Obviously, that was never going to happen with a lowborn like Thomas Cromwell, but he was very good at working the game in a ways that he probably couldn't foresee that affected what became the British parliamentary system. So it's all very, very, very fascinating. All right, I'm going to leave it there. I might just have a long video. Sorry for that. Yes. So, Jason, I'm really, I watch your videos, Jason, and I can see how much you are kind of emotionally kind of caught up in this. And I feel like I'm a step back. I'm very engaged. It's one of these books that I wanted to go back to because it's like, well, why, what about it is not, it's not catching me on an emotional level for the most part. There are some scenes. There's the death of his wife, the death of his daughters. But I can also see him. I can see Hilary Mantel pulling my strings maybe a little bit too much. A little bit too much aware of that. Even while I'm in awe and respect of how she is beautifully putting all this together. And just as an interesting thought experiment of how another way you might imagine this a fellow from long ago, which none of us can ever actually know. None of us can know, but we can imagine, which is the work of history and the work of fiction. And lovely, lovely work it is. So more videos later.